In the Controls in Excel Files video, we discussed how to put controls into your Excel file and the different types of controls that are available. For example, I've inserted a button control into this particular Excel file, and I can tie some code to this button that will run when we click on it. And you can see I've named this button Add Employee, and over on the right here I have a table. That is just an example of a table you might use to track all of your employees. So we can leave this Excel file just like this and let each individual user come in and add a row to this table and fill it out manually. Alternatively, we could create a form that will actually pop up on the screen when we click on Add Employee, and we will fill out the form and let the form add that information to the table for us. And there are a couple of reasons we might do this. One is to eliminate any human error. We can build some checks, some error checks into the form that'll make sure we actually did enter a date, for example, or one of the roles that got entered is actually a valid role and we're only selecting full or part-time. If we wanted to generate an employee ID, for example, that's something that we could do in code. And so there's a couple different reasons that we might use code for something like this. This is a pretty simple example of what we might want to build a user form for. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is actually insert a form into our Excel file. So we'll go up to the Developer tab and open up our Visual Basic. And now up here in Insert, where we usually select Module, we're going to click on User Form instead. And then we can talk about this screen for a second. So this block you see here, this is the actual form that you've inserted. This is the window that'll pop up on the screen. This is what your users will see and interact with. So this is what we're going to be working on and what we're going to be building. This toolbox over on the right side of my screen, this contains all of the different controls that we'll be talking about in this video, and we'll go through these one by one. If your toolbox doesn't pop up automatically, or if it ever disappears, you can get it back by clicking on this toolbox button up at the top of your screen. The other thing to pay attention to is the Properties window over on the left, which we'll cover in more depth since it has a lot of really important properties that you might want to adjust, and we'll do that in a later video. So first, let's expand our form here. I'll just click on the corner and drag it out so we have a little bit more room to work with. And we can take a look at all of these different controls in our toolbox. So the first one we'll look at is this little A, and this just means label. So we'll click on it, we'll go ahead and draw it on our form across the top like this, and we can see it shows up and it says label 1. If we double click into this box, or if you just click a second time into this box, you'll see you'll be able to actually type in here. So we'll just type, this is our example form. Something like this, and then we'll click out of this. We can see our toolbox will pop back up. I'm going to move it over to the side of my screen, do some rearranging so I don't have to keep finding it again. And so this is just a label, and what this means is this actually doesn't perform any purpose on our form. This isn't something that the user will be able to change or interact with. It's just text that's going to show up that'll help us give instructions to the user, or maybe clarify what this particular box on the form is supposed to be. So we definitely use labels a lot. And again, we'll talk about this property window down here later, but there are some things in here that you'll probably want to adjust. So for now, we'll just leave our little example label up there. I'm going to click back onto the form to get out of the example label. Next, I'm going to click on this, which is a text box. And I'll just click somewhere on the form, drag it out, and create a little text box. Now this is something that the user actually will interact with. This is an empty text box that they're going to be able to type into. And again, we'll cover the properties later, but just as an example, we have this text box. Now we have ListBox and ComboBox, which are these two right here. And there's a little bit of a difference between the two. So ComboBox, and we'll go ahead and just draw a ComboBox onto our form. And we can just make it about the same size as our text box. And we can see it has this little drop-down arrow right here. So with a combo box, we can preset this list to be maybe on our form, this is like our roles. So maybe we have manager, designer, product support, something like that. And we can select this drop-down and we'll see that list populate, and we can select from this list. Now on a combo box, you can also type your own answer into the box itself, and there's a setting that we can turn off to control that, but that's the primary difference between combo box and a list box. So if we draw a list box onto the form now, and we'll draw this one a little bit bigger, The list box you'll see doesn't actually have this drop-down arrow, and that's because we're going to have a whole bunch of options that appear in this box. If we have too many options, they can scroll down using the vertical scroll bar that'll show up on the right here. But generally speaking, a list box takes up a lot more space on your screen, and so a lot of people will just use combo boxes, and we can control the property that allows the user to custom enter their own information if we don't want them to be able to do that. Next, we have a checkbox, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can double click into this control here to change whatever the checkbox is. So we'll say maybe full-time or something like that, and we'll click back out of it. Next, we have this option button. And the difference between a checkbox and an option button is that you typically have multiple option buttons on here. So maybe this time we have one that says full-time and one that says part-time. And in our code, we can actually set this up so that these options are tied to one another. So if we select full-time, part-time automatically is unselected, or if we select part-time, full-time is automatically unselected. So if you have a couple of different options and you don't want to use something like a combo box to select from them, you might use an option group. And again, this is all something that you would want to group together, whereas the checkbox is something that is a standalone item. You can have multiple checkboxes on your form, and you can interact with them individually and get different results. Next, we have this toggle button. And what the toggle button does is you can either click it and it will stay clicked, or you can click on it again and it will actually unclick on this button. So this might be something where you have two different versions of the form. Maybe one version of the form is for managers and one version of the form is for regular employees. So you might click this toggle button to toggle your manager side of the form. And at that point, we can go into the code and we can say, we want you to hide this field and this field, and we want you to show these new fields over here. And that's typically what you would use the toggle button for. It's a little more complicated than you really need in Excel VBA, so you won't see this very often, but it does have a unique application that might fit a specific purpose for you. Next, we have this frame, and this can be good for organizing different things. So if I draw this frame on here, you can see it shows up with the text frame 1, and we can change this in the properties section of our form over here in caption. And again, we'll cover the properties later on, but just as an example, we'll say full or part time, something like this. And maybe we want to put our option groups into this frame to help organize our form a little bit. So we can drag them on there, and now these option groups are part of this frame. So we can see if I drag this frame, it's actually going to pull my option groups with it. So this is a super helpful tool for organizing your form. It makes it easy to shift things around later, and it also makes it easy for the user to identify all of this information is grouped together. This is one subsection of my form. So it's useful for cleaning up your form as well. So I'll pull my toolbox back over here, and the next thing we're going to look at is a regular command button. So I'll go ahead and insert one of these on the form. And we can see right off the bat it looks very similar to the toggle button and also to the command buttons that we can insert onto our regular Excel file. And this serves a same sort of purpose. So if we click on this button, we can tie code to it that's going to run after we click on this. So we'll go ahead and create a close button, and then I'll insert another one, and I will call this button add. And I found it's best to generally go ahead and give your users a close button, even though they could also exit out of the form by clicking on the actual X itself. And that's just because it gives them something that they feel is an alternative to the actual add button. So if they don't want to add this information, they don't want to save this information, they can use the close button instead and know that none of this is going to get saved. So these next four controls here, the scroll bar, spin button, image, and reference edit controls, aren't used as often as the rest of these controls are. You probably won't find yourself ever in the situation where you need to use these four, but we'll go ahead and go through them. So we'll click on scroll bar and click onto our screen. And you can see the scroll bar shows up, and this acts more like a slider than it does really a control or a scroll bar. So this is the kind of situation where maybe you have an interest rate or something, and you can drag this bar up or down to change that interest rate. So there's a lot of code that goes into making this operate properly, And it's not used as often because it's just as easy for the user to manually type in the interest rate in something like a text box. So you won't see the scroll bar used very often. You can also have a spin button, which we'll go ahead and insert over here as well. And the spin button you can see are just up and down arrows. So these are just used to increase or decrease the value. So it's good for fields like age, for example, where you might just want to increase or decrease your value by 1. But again, you could just use a text box for this, so not very common to see the spin button on a form. Now the images control, I'm not even going to insert on the form. They get a little messy because you have to make sure the image you're pointing to is on a shared network drive. If the image is on your local computer storage drive and someone opens this form on a different computer, the form will actually enter a loop error trying to locate that file. So generally the image control isn't used very often, and it's not usual that you would need to have an image on your form in the first place. Now, the reference edit control lets the user select a range of cells in the workbook. And this can be helpful if your code does something like automatically formatting a range of cells, or if you're searching through data for a particular value, but 9 times out of 10, your range is going to be predetermined using something like a table. So this won't be used very often. So the last control that we haven't talked about yet is this multi-page and the tab strip. And these both do similar things. So we'll talk about the multi-page since this is more common to see in forms. So I'm actually going to expand my form and give us some room over here to insert this new control. And I'll click on the multi-page and go ahead and drag it out. Now the tab strip does something very similar. It doesn't have this kind of frame that you see on the multi-page, so most people will just go ahead and use the multi-page. So this is where we were talking about earlier with our toggle button, for example. You might be toggling back and forth between I'm adding a manager versus I'm adding an employee. This is a separate way that you might accomplish that. This is also good for breaking out if you have lots of information that's kind of too much for one form. Maybe you don't want to use a whole bunch of frames like this. Maybe you want to actually separate out that information onto separate pages that we can toggle back and forth between. So if I, for example, grab my toolbox, and if I insert a label onto my page 1 here, and we see this says label 2, when I toggle to my page 2, that label 2 disappears. And this works for all of our other controls as well. So if I insert, for example, an actual text box that we could type into, and I insert this onto my page 2 of my tabbed control here, when I come back over, now I'm toggling between page 1, which has the label, and page 2, which has the actual text box. So this can be a really powerful tool for if you have a form that has a lot of information on it that needs to get filled out. Or maybe you have different roles and each of these roles needs different information to go along with it. That's the kind of thing where you might want to have a multi-page document like this going across the top of your screen where they could individually click on each page and walk through that information. It's also really good for building a dashboard. So if you have a lot of different functions that go into your database, maybe you have an entire set of functions for an administrator and then an entire set of functions for a salesperson, and maybe you have a third page and that's all a set of functions for your production line. This is something where you could put a whole bunch of buttons actually onto these pages and use this as your dashboard rather than trying to create a dashboard on your actual Excel file. So these are all of the different tools that you would see, the different controls that you might insert onto a form. And an example of the form would be building something like the employee add form, which we will be doing over the course of the next couple of videos to actually set this up and tie it to code and make sure everything's running smoothly.